Good morning, dear second prep students. This is Mrs. Lamia Mohamed. Today I'm going to give you chapter 2, The Prison of Zenda, with the title A Merry Evening with a New Relation. I'll give you this chapter through reading and explaining some main points. But before we start chapter 2, we have to revise some important points in chapter 1. In chapter 1, Rasendel went to Ruritania to attend the coronation of the King Rodolph V. He knew that Stralsund would be crowded and it wouldn't be easy for him to find or to book a room there. That's why he stopped at Zenda and he booked a room there in a small hotel, which was owned by an old lady and her 2 daughters. He knew from them that half the people of Ruritania preferred Michael to be the king and the other half preferred the king. Rasendel decided to go for a walk the following day in the forest of Zenda. He hoped to see the king there. In chapter 2, Rasendel went for a walk in the forest of Zenda. He saw the old castle and he saw another modern one. The modern one was the Duke's house. The 2 castles were joined together by a drawbridge. After walking for an hour or more in the forest, Rasendel fell asleep. He was woken by 2 of the king's men who were looking at him with much curiosity. They were very surprised on seeing him. They wanted to know everything about him because he looked exactly like the king. One of them was Sapt, who was short and very strongly built, and the other was Fritz, who was thin, of a middle height with dark hair. While talking together, they introduced themselves and they heard the king's voice. Both Rasendel and the king were surprised at looking as they looked exactly like each other, because Rasendel was surprised to see the king in front of him. Both of them were surprised when they looked at each other because they resembled each other or they looked exactly like each other. Sapt and Fritz told the king that Rasendel came from England to attend the coronation, and the king at that time was very excited. He told Fritz that he couldn't wait. He wanted to see Michael's reaction when he would see both of them. So both Sapt and Fritz believed that it wouldn't be a good idea for Rasendel to attend the coronation. That's why Rasendel decided to leave that night. But before leaving, the king invited him to dine with him in the hunting lodge of Duke Michael. They went there to the hunting lodge and they found Joseph, the king's servant, and an old woman who was Johann's mother. The king drank a lot of wine that night. The food was delicious. The king was very happy that night. After drinking a lot, while drinking a lot, both Sapt and Fritz tried to stop the king from drinking a lot of wine, but they could not stop the king. They tried to convince him or to warn him that the next day they had to leave early, but he did not listen. What happened that after the king drank a lot of wine, Joseph brought him a bottle of wine from Michael, saying that Michael asked him to give that bottle to the king when the king was tired of all the other wine. After drinking from the bottle of wine of Michael, the king fell asleep, and in the end they all fell asleep. But what happened the next day, that they could not wake up the king because the king was wrapped. He could not move. His face was red. They tried to help him, but they couldn't. Sapt threw some water over Rasandel to wake him up, and Sabt suspected that Michael was the one who drugged the king because he was lying on the floor. As I told you, he could not move. And Sabt suspected that Michael drugged him for his own reasons. He wanted to prevent the king from going to the coronation in order to take his place and to be crowned instead of the king. Both Sabt and Fritz thought that it wasn't a good idea to bring a doctor because they said that 1,000 of doctors could not help the king to get to Strelso that day. And again, it wasn't a good idea to tell the people that the king was ill. Also, Sabt agreed with Fritz that if the king was not crowned that day, he would never be the king. So Sabt had a plan for Rasandel. He tried to convince Rasandel to take the king's place only for one day in order to prevent Michael from going to the coronation or taking the king's place. At last, Rasandel was convinced to go to the coronation to take the king's place, to prevent Michael from becoming the king or to prevent Michael from being crowned instead of the king. This is all for chapter 2. So let's revise again the most important points. The first meeting that happened between the king and Rasandel, and both of them were surprised because they looked exactly like each other. That night, when Rasandel was dining with the king drank a lot of wine and was in the end drugged because of the last bottle of wine of Michael's. Also, another main point was that Sabt had a plan for Rasandel to go to the coronation and replace the king only for one day in order to prevent Michael from taking the king's place. Now, let's move to the questions. Sabt and Fritz were surprised on seeing Rasandel for the first time. Why were they surprised? Because he looked so much like the king and it was hard for anyone to know the difference between them. They looked exactly like each other. I'd give 1,000 pounds to see Brother Michael's face when he sees a pair of us. The king said these words to Fritz after meeting or seeing Rasandel for the first time. He was very excited. He said that he couldn't wait to see his brother's reaction when he sees both of them. Sabt suspected that Michael drugged his brother, the king, for certain reasons. He had his own reasons to drug his brother. He wanted to prevent him from going to the coronation, and thus he wanted to take his place and become the king. Fritz and Sabt had a plan for the king after he had been drugged. They persuaded or convinced Rasandel to take the king's place for one day to stop Michael from taking the king's crown or to be crowned instead of the king. This is all for chapter 2. Thank you for listening and goodbye.